Welcome to the How to Succeed podcast, the show that helps you get to the top and stay there. This is how to succeed at applying DISC in the sales profession. The following podcast is copyrighted by Sandler Systems, Inc. and protected by U.S. copyright laws. Sandler is the worldwide leader in sales, management, and customer service training. You can find us on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or if you're looking for a Sandler trainer or more free resources, go to sandler.com. I'm your host, Mike Montague, Director of Community Engagement at Sandler. And my guest this week is John Moore, a longtime Sandler trainer, and we're going to talk with him about how to succeed at applying DISC. So, John, welcome to the podcast. Tell me a little bit about DISC, what we're talking about today, maybe for salespeople, and why should people be paying attention to DISC?
Well, it's a behavior model. It's a way of connecting or not connecting. And in sales, the people that win are the people that connect on a much deeper level and not that superficial level.
Yeah. And I think, for DISC, we should probably give everybody up front. I've explained this a few times on the podcast. We also have other episodes. So if you want to go, search DISC in the podcast, you can find earlier episodes on entry-level DISC, but this one we're going to try and take an advanced swing. So just in case everybody hasn't heard it, I kind of think of it as your behavioral style is the way you approach going out in the big, scary world, what you think the best approach is. So we have a dominant, influencer, steady relator, and compliant. And the way I describe it is dominants are the people that think, it's a big, scary, dangerous world out there. The way to get along in it is to be big, bad, and scary yourself. And then that way, nobody will mess with you. Influencers think, what the way to get along in this world is to be liked. If you have fun and people like you, nobody will hurt you. And S's are the don't rock the boat people. They say, if we just stay steady, if we fly under the radar, if we don't make too many waves, nobody will bother us. We can get along with what we want to do. And then the compliant people are the ones that say, like, you got to be perfect. You got to follow a system. You got to follow the rules. And as long as you check all the boxes, dot all the I's, cross all the T's, you'll be just fine in this big, scary world out there. Anything else you would add as far as like a setup here that we need to know about DISC before we continue our conversation?
Well, I would think to me, it's a lot like a language. People speak different languages, Spanish, English, French. And the goal here is being integrity-based and saying, okay, I want to honor that person by speaking their language and not looking at it as being manipulative or tricky or whatever. It's about integrity. It's about full disclosure, like we like to talk about. And so it's really about, okay, I sense they talk a little different language, and I'm going to move into that language as a way of connecting, as a way of being respectful.
You know what? I love that as our first attitude, because I think the analogy is almost perfect, right? That if you're a D, yelling louder or your D language, more forceful is not going to get the job done for somebody that's an S. And usually the ones on the opposite corners have the most trouble. So I's and C's and S's and D's when they get together. I see that a lot though, right? We see people do that and they're like, well, I explained it to her. If I just explain it again with more detail, that will make it clearer. And that doesn't really work. What you need to do is change the language that they can understand. And then some magic does unlock, especially in sales, when you're trying to connect on an emotional level or with what's important to them, that when you hit those right notes and you use words that they can connect to, it really makes a big difference, doesn't it?
Words, it's interesting you just brought up words in my notes. We say words are about 7% of communication. But I'll tell you right now, you use the wrong word with the wrong style, and you will set them in orbit. So if you're talking to a high D, you're not going to say something along the lines of, okay, in my opinion. That will set them in orbit. They don't care about your opinion. If you're with a high I and you say something like, hey, this is the same for everybody, or everybody will look the same, that's going to set them up. A high steady relator, if I use the term, this is going to require massive change, or we're going to go in there and we're just going to gut everything and start over again. or the way you're doing things now, it's really not right. That's going to shut them down completely. And if you're with a high C, you say something along the lines like, hey, this is brand new. You're going to love it. The words absolutely will set fires off in their brains. So being mindful, watching your language, and I have to watch mine anyway, but when it comes to the styles, being very mindful of your word selection.
And what do you feel like is any other common misconceptions and myths about using DISC in sales, or ideal attitudes we need to have? How do we think about this as a way to leverage, encourage the best communication possible, the best conversation possible, without feeling disingenuous or that we're not ourselves and authentic? I think that's tough.
Yeah, it is. And it's not about going from your corner all the way over to somebody else's. That's going to be a stretch. You're not going to come across as authentic. But you can move a couple of steps in their direction. And a lot of times people can use DISC as an excuse. In other words, well, they're a high D, they won't listen. Or they're a high C, they're never going to make a decision. Or those kind of people. That becomes an excuse and not a valid one. I have turned scenarios on their ear just by picking up on something and moving closer to their style. I'm 100% D, 96 I. The other two don't exist. And one of the things I do realize is my attitude is I can communicate with any style. I must communicate with any style. To avoid people or make excuses is abusing the language. And frankly, so few salespeople are good at this. We can become, that can be a huge differentiator for us right off the bat. Understanding it, learning it, and then just using it as a way of connecting on a deeper level and with respect and integrity.
Yeah, Amy Woodall, another Sandler trainer, says own your 50. You can't take 100% responsibility for communication, but you can at least own your 50%. You can meet them halfway and you can connect with them as best you can. I think that's a good attitude to have as we get started here too. Now, as we move to the behavior bucket, this is where I think it gets interesting specifically for salespeople, because there are some things that we can do to maybe research ahead of time to find out what their DISC profile is, or if we're in a decision-making process and there are different styles in a room, in a boardroom we're presenting to talk about how we would present or discuss the issues in different styles at the same time. I'm also thinking about a lot of tools. Maybe we save those for technique like Crystal Knows or your CRM system. But when you think about doing the right thing at the right time as a salesperson, what comes to mind for you here?
Well, if I'm making a cold call and I get a voicemail, I take the voicemail and I listen to it. And I will pick up on that person's style through that voicemail. And I'd say I'm 80% of the time right. Because that's all you have to do is be aware, listen to the voicemail. You don't even have to leave a message, or you can if you want, but if you do, match that style. You mentioned, I'll go on LinkedIn and I'll find out what positions have they had. I had a referral into an organization, never met the person, got online, found out this person was from, the background was in accounting, finance, a member of the International Accounting Society. So I knew there's got to be some C there. But on the website, they were the president of the division. This person was in a leadership role. So I thought, well, probably going to be a D and a C, a dominant and a compliant style. And it turned out right. So to your point, doing that ahead of time will make a huge difference in your comfort level and being prepared, getting your mindset, rehearsing a little bit and saying, okay, I got to watch my verbiage a little bit. If it's a high D and they come on strong, don't let it throw me. That's their style. That's their language. That's how they talk.
And when you think about the sales process, what are some key moments? I'm thinking obviously early, in bonding and rapport and making a connection. It helps to speak their language. And I think the second most obvious one would be in the close and the presentation, and crafting your pitch to match their needs and their emotions and behaviors. Does anything else come to mind, or maybe we can just dive deeper on those two and talk about how we leverage these?
Well, absolutely. So the first thing is, if you don't know the style to the best of your ability, go in there aware. Turn off autopilot and be a tremendous mindful observer. And don't let the styles throw you. If it's a high dominant, what I've learned, if you know the Sandler process, bonding and rapport is the first compartment. With a high D, who oftentimes we work with, that bonding and rapport is at the end. It's not in the front. So don't try it. Don't try to talk about the weather. Just go with it. They'll jump right in. How are you? Good. Sit down. The reason you're here today. A lot of times the high D scares people. In reality, the nice thing, is they'll tell you what they want, when they want it, how they want it. I don't have to work hard. And if I do it well, the high dominant will bond at the end. They'll say, hey, I appreciate you coming over. Hey, how long you been with the company? So, just go with it. A high S, be aware they're going to be more laid back. They're going to be very warm, very cordial, but if you're the opposite style, they could appear being standoffish. So for me, 100% D, 100% I find some drugs, calm myself down. Just a joke. I just calm myself down and I try to listen back. And, my tone is softer, and that's just being respectful. And if it's a high C, a high compliant, the thing I would coach people on a high C is they oftentimes can come across with questions that sound like objections. And boy, can that throw me. So one time I was at a meeting and the person said, okay, precisely, what is your validation methodology? I'll tell you, I flunked statistics twice. I couldn't give you a clue. But to me, that sounded like a objection. Using the science, I simply, being genuine, said, look, I got to tell you, those styles, frankly, or those studies are really out of my comprehension. But if you'd like, I'll gladly send them to you and invite you to take a look at them. And he said that would be fine. After the meeting, he cornered me for a half hour. The guy teaches statistics, loves statistics. So be very careful that we don't misinterpret the high C in their question that may seem like an objection. So don't, like you say, own your 50, but be observant and don't let it throw you if it's the opposite language.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really good things in there. One, it made me think of starting the meeting, that our upfront contract and the way we approach a sale should be neutral, but it should also tell you a lot about what their style is, right? Do they want to talk about the people in their agenda, or do they want to talk about the data and validation, or do they want to talk about the results? Like, what they're saying is important to include in the agenda should really also tell you a lot about where they're coming from. But it can also work well regardless of the style. So I know I wanted to ask you about the biggest fear, because I use that technique to either bring up my weakness in my disc style. So you and I are pretty similar. I'm more on the IS side, but with the C, I'll say, hey, data is not my thing. If you need help with that up front, I'm going to have to call somebody else in, or I'll probably have to get you those answers and come back. I generally work in generalities, right? Or I could get you in the ballpark. That's probably not what you're going to hear. So my biggest fear is I'm not going to have your answer. Or we could do it on the other side and say, I know you're a high D. My biggest fear is you're going to want to move faster than I do. And you're going to be frustrated here if I ask you too many questions. And by bringing those things up, we can start working on that middle ground and giving them permission to raise their hand if we're not going in the direction we want them to go. Any tips there, and especially in presentation or in opening?
I don't know that I actually do that, but that's not a bad comment to just lay it out there. The thing though with the high D, and again, I guess in any of these, we don't want to show any sign of tentativeness or apology or unpreparedness. So again, let your authenticity, let your conviction show through. But again, conviction, just every style overplayed becomes a weakness. And that's what we have to be aware of. You know, high D is a phenomenal style, but overplayed, it comes across arrogant. So be aware of your style and what it looks like if you overemphasize it and where it looks like at its worst. So yeah, I think it's just being, you know, if a high D is going too fast, the one thing I like to coach people on a high D is push back. If I had not learned Mike, if I had not learned the DISC language, I'd be out of business today. Because in my business and a lot of people, we deal with a high dominance, not all, but a lot of high Ds. And I came across way too way too chatty, way too happy-go-lucky. They didn't see me as bringing anything to the table. A high D basically wants to know, do I want to spend any of my valuable time with you? Everybody does, but high D wants to know it quick. So it's important to push back to a high D respectfully when you need to. So if I said, listen, we really need to start evaluating before we dive into throwing training at a problem. And the high D says, no, we don't need to do that. I know what's wrong. Anytime I acquiesced and said, oh, okay, well, we'll skip that. I never got the business. Because the high D has a saying, if there's two people in the room and we both agree, one of us is not necessary. So we politely push back and it's simply saying, look, you know, I got to disagree with you. Can I share with you why? And they'll immediately stop and say, what? And you'll give it to them and they'll say, all right, that makes sense. So, you know, be aware that you have to, you know, there's times when we need to push back, not arrogantly, not ego driven, but in a manner that shows that we have conviction and we're, you know, that we're here, we bring value.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I know we don't have time to walk through all 4 styles. That's one of the tricky things about the DISC thing on this podcast format. But certainly you can ask your trainer about it and get some help or dive deeper. But what I love you said there is every style also needs to be challenged on their weaknesses because we want to give them what they want. I always call it the ice cream vegetable analogy, right? For C's, the ice cream is data, but the vegetables they need though is that they're going to have to make a decision with some uncertainty. They're going to have to at some point say it's close enough, and we got to challenge them on that part, right? High I's, they'll give you all the information, they'll talk all day, but at some point we're probably gonna have to challenge them to get back on agenda or to look at the details and get narrowed down. So I love what you said there of we want to meet them where they are, but then we also probably gently need to nudge or pull them in the direction of what they're not so that they can get to a good decision because they're going to have weaknesses or they need to sell other people on their team, right? So they might be the high I and they're all bought in, but they're going to need data for their technical users that they go back to later to pitch this to. And I think that's a really great lesson here. Anything else come to mind as far as technique? I know we shouted out some earlier we didn't cover, but what would you say are great tools, tips, hacks, technologies to use here with DISC?
Well, I think, you know, watch people's emails and be very observant just on an email. I've sent emails to a high D and they replied with one word. And we can immediately think, oh, they're mad, don't let it throw you. Match that email. If it's a different style where they may, you know, don't jump right in. So slow down, read the email and respond in a manner of likeness, you know, and if I'm too abrupt too many times, so if it's a high S or a high I got to slow down. Hey, I was just on a call with a super high I, spent the first 10 minutes asking him about his trip and his dogs. So it's about just using the language and go and respectfully going into somebody else's world.
Yeah, I think that's a great technique, especially when you've already mentioned you can listen to their voicemail, you can check out their LinkedIn profile, you can use a tool like Crystal Knows or
Yeah.
even Gong Call Analytics and kind of dive into what their talk times have been or the words that they choose and stuff. You can really get nerdy, especially in a big long, enterprise sale or long sales cycle. You're going to have lots of meetings with these people. You can figure out early and then start crafting your communication to it. And I think there is a lot. Sometimes people miss that emails are different than phone calls and meetings. And I love what you said about a D in a one-word email.
Yeah.
Is the fact that they even gave you a response is a positive sign, right?
Right.
That if it wasn't worth their time, they would have ignored it and left it unread and not responded at all. So I think there are some things sometimes that you can read into these and you can do to improve your chances of moving the sale forward and stuff. Does anything come to mind here for making progress or closing the sale specifically when we're trying to match with these different things? How do you use DISC later in a sales cycle?
Well, I think it's a great question, being aware. So again, a high C, or a high D, let me start there. I hope I'm not overemphasizing the D, but I think the high D is going to make a decision like a microwave oven. And if you're not a fast decision maker, you might be a different style. You may leave that meeting and that person could have bought and did the business right then. So let the submarine or let your selling process do the work. Don't think, well, you probably need time to think about this, or, okay, well, I'll get back to you. They could be ready to make that decision right now. So be in the moment, be present. But if you're at the point where you're making a presentation, whatever, man, match the style. It's a high D, bullet points, move on. High I, use some of those words we talked about. This is a very unique, one of a kind type of a solution that we're offering for you with a high steady relator. They want to know that you're going to be with them and you're going to support them, and things like, if I'm working with a high S, I may come back and say, let's not eat the whole apple in one bite. What if we start with this part first, get your feeling, get you involved, co-create it, and then let's see how that goes. Make sure we go to the second one so that we're not upsetting the apple cart, we're not stressing people. With a high C, it's beautiful. Rather than in our world, rather than dive right in with something, I think we need to get a baseline. I think we need to start with some data. And so my suggestion, my proposal is we start with a project of analysis. And I'm going to say the same thing to all four people, but I'm going to use different terminology, tonality, and words in my presentation.
Yeah, that's so great. And I think if you have multiple people in the room, you can even do that. And sometimes it gets repetitive, but I like to hit, hey, customer success S person over here, we're going to make sure this rollout is smooth and all of your people are going to get, held by the hand and walk through this process. And D, we're going to make sure that we do that quickly so we get results as fast as possible. And C, we're going to use that onboarding process to get feedback and improve the process for the next rollouts and the next waves. And hi, I'm going to need your help in facilitating these onboarding sessions and stuff, right?
That's
and we've
beautiful.
hit everybody through quickly through these different messages. And I think it's possible.
Yeah, well, exactly right. Beautifully done. And that's what happens. And so we can communicate with everyone. We just have to be aware, because you leave somebody's style out, and they could be the one that cuts your legs off.
So let's learn a little bit more about you here, John. We've learned a little bit about your style, but I'd love to know more about your background. On the How to Succeed podcast, I like to ask people what their definition of success is. What would you say?
Okay. Well, Mark Twain said, the two most important days of your life are the day you were born and the day you find out why. And to me, success is when you know why you were put here and you're immersed in it and you're doing it. That's to me a success.
And was there a biggest lesson learned or hurdle you had to get over in your career in order to be successful?
Yeah, me. Uh, and I would say, I think, look at the talents that you have, look at the strengths and the things that you bring to the table, and utilize those. You've been given everything you need to be successful. But I oftentimes thought, well, I had to be more like that person. I had to be a better cold caller. I had to go for the juggler more. No, you've got the talents, you've got the abilities, unshackle them, allow them to flow, and use yourself. And that's what I love about Sandler. You don't have to be anybody else. Take your talents, your gifts, your motivation, your conviction, and run it through the submarine your way, and you'll be successful. Don't wait to be somebody else.
And what's your favorite Sandler rule?
Our job is to get to the truth, even if it's what we don't want to hear.
I love that. And we are updating that rule in a new Sandler rules book here. Came out in 2022. So I love that one. I think a lot of salespeople miss that. They try to convince people or change the truth, and that's not your job. So let's wrap it up for everybody. Based on applying DISC in sales, what is one attitude you'd like people to have?
Flexibility. Be flexible. It doesn't matter what your style is, it's what you do with it. Move to the other style out of respect and be a good connector.
And one key action item or behavior to do?
Research. Don't let it die here. Learn, dive into it. Our Sandler websites have so much fantastic information. Become a student of this and be mindful of it every day.
And the best technique, tool, or hack to use?
Listen to voicemails and pre-brief. Pre-brief your calls. Pre-brief your calls. And if you have an idea what their style is, get your head in the game, bullet your upfront contract, write down your pain questions in the manner you will that'll work with their style. So pre-brief so that when you show up for the game, you can be present and do your best.
Yeah, I love that. Listen to the voicemail recordings that they play for you when they dodge your call, but then also any messages they leave or send you an email or voicemail to get tips and pay attention. Listen, great stuff today. Once again, that's John Moore, longtime Sandler trainer. For more information on Sandler, you can find us at sandler.com. Don't forget to reach out to your local Sandler trainer if you need a DISC profile and find out what yours is, or you need some more coaching and encouragement on how to pre-brief or debrief those calls based on DISC. As always, you can subscribe to this podcast now if you haven't already, or share it with somebody that you think needs to hear it. Thank you for listening, and remember, whatever you are, be a good one. The How to Succeed podcast is brought to you by Sandler, the worldwide leader in sales, management, and customer service training with over 200 locations. For more information, visit sandler.com.
The Sandler Summit returns.